U.S. military action cannot be the only or even primary component of our leadership in every instance. Just because we have the best hammer does not mean that every problem is a nail.
President Obama, speaking at West Point Military Academy, wants to scale back the military muscle. Obama also defended his decision to keep the military out of Syria, but our next guest says Obama attacked his own foreign policy during that speech. Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart.com, joining us from New York. Joel, I watched the speech. I liked some of it, didn't like other parts of it, but I think at the end of the day, polls show that the majority of Americans, this includes, this crosses party lines, they more or less support the idea of not going into Syria and in places like that. They are war weary. Doesn't he just have his finger on the pulse?
He doesn't really, because what he's done is articulated a foreign policy that, while bits of it might be supported by the bulk of Americans, contradicts his own performance in office. Most Americans probably would say that Libya was a mistake, for example, and yet he went into Libya without congressional authorization. And in fact, the day he gave that speech, the U.S. was evacuating Americans from Libya, a rather failed foreign policy adventure. So much of what he articulated in that speech is consistent with what many Americans believe, but much of it is also contradicted by his actual record in office.
So, and I know there was one line where he's saying, look, unilateral force is only going to be used these days going forward when our core interests are at stake, and then the multilateral stuff, working with NATO and whatnot, is when it's going to be secondary things. I mean, I think that's a pretty wise foreign policy for a war-weary nation, a deeply indebted nation, and this goes whether it's a Democratic or Republican president, good idea to adopt. But I guess you'd counter with that saying, yeah, fine, good words, but it's just not meeting up with reality. Is that the problem?
That is largely the problem. I mean, one of the other things he said was that we will intervene where Americans are threatened. And of course, the whole Benghazi scandal is around the fact that the U.S. did not intervene. We still don't know what President Obama did that night, for example, why he did not order troops to do more than they might have done to save the people who were under attack. So that's an experience we have of the president's foreign policy in effect that is contradicted by the fine words he spoke at West Point. But the other thing is that while Americans want to stay out of conflicts, they don't want to completely withdraw from the world. And military force is not the only way to use the military. So, for example, in Ukraine...
But Joel, hold on. Was
yes.
this actually talking about a complete withdrawal? Because, we talk about Obama being soft, and I will, hammer him on that when that's legitimate. I didn't see that much of this going on here, though.
Well, look, he cited the Ukraine as an example of success. All we've done in the Ukraine is send them rations, i.e. spam, literally, things to eat. We did not use military aid the way we might have to shore up the Ukrainian government. There are other ways to use the military other than going to war or sending troops on the ground. The president knows this, but he preferred to use a straw man there and saying, well, I disagree with the isolationists to the one side and the extreme interventionists on the other. Well, so do most Americans. But he didn't lay out a set of principles that would guide future intervention or non-intervention, nor did he lay out a series of principles that would have agreed with what he's actually done. This speech was panned by the liberal media in the United States, by the New York Times, Washington Post. Wall Street Journal is conservative, but everybody basically said, look, this didn't really tell us anything new. It didn't really explain anything he's done, and it doesn't really set a course for leadership in the future.
My favorite sign of American leadership was just Sarah Palin saying last year, let Allah figure it out in relation to Syria. I think folks see their money going to places like Syria or Nigeria. Canada gave Nigeria $50 million the other year, and they still can't get this group of ragtag guys who have those 300 girls. But I mean, that's another story. I want to play a clip right now in which Barack Obama talked about a national security threat. And this is where I think the speech totally went way off the rails here. Check this out.
That spirit of cooperation needs to energize the global effort to combat climate change, a creeping national security crisis that will help shape your time in uniform.
And I think this is where we have a real far leftist agenda. Admiral Mike McMullen had said the debt, that's a national security issue. Why, Joel, why is he even bringing up climate change in this speech? I don't get it.
Well, they've sought to define everything either as a national security issue, which means you have to deal with it urgently, or as a right in the case of healthcare, which means you have to grant it immediately. And the idea of framing climate change as a national security threat is a way of translating it into terms that every American can't help but agree with. But of course, we know that it isn't a national security threat. We know that it poses some challenges to coastlines. It'll change the way we navigate the world and so forth. But that calls for adjustments in our national security strategy. It doesn't call for, building radical defenses or coordinating the kind of international control that would be necessary to impose carbon limits on countries like China, which until now have shown no interest at all in reducing their emissions and are the leading polluters in the world.
Do you think at the end of the day, average Americans are going to come on board with the idea that the U.S. has to play more of a role in these regions, or do you think they are going to be a bit more isolationist, regardless of the party lines?
I think Americans want to be involved in the world, but they want to be involved effectively. And I think part of the problem that Obama faces is nobody trusts him to be effective anymore. When you can't even run the Veterans Administration hospitals back home, when you leak the name of the Afghanistan station chief for the CIA in a press release, when you do these kinds of things, they tend to suggest a sort of incompetence that Americans don't want to see carried overseas, especially when troops' lives are on the line. Bush lost support after Hurricane Katrina because people felt that we were sending our military overseas but not using it to evacuate people who needed desperate relief in New Orleans. And I think Obama's faced a similar moment over these several scandals where people have said, look, the guy just can't run an administration. The difference is Obama came in promising competence, promising a complete break with the past, and we've seen the opposite. So I don't think Americans are necessarily opposed to foreign engagement. We are skeptical of foreign engagement. That's a tradition going back to Washington. But it is also something we are aware that we have to do sometimes, and we want to do it well.
I think saying what's in it for me doesn't make one an isolationist in terms of just, going to a place like Syria and I don't even know what's in it for me, a bunch of sectarian struggles there. But do you think this is really just Barack Obama saying, well, I'm lame duck anyway, so I might as well just put forward a philosophy that makes it look like I'm a winner no matter what?
I think what he's trying to do here is resurrect the ghost of the Bush administration and say, look, no matter how bad things are and chaotic they are, I'm giving you a philosophy that's fundamentally different from that which went before. The problem is it isn't. I mean, if you ask him to justify why he wanted to send troops to Syria in the first place, he basically reiterated the justification for war with Iraq and said, well, the UN won't act, so we must. That was basically what Bush said. Look, I think Syria is a different problem because the fundamental problem in Syria isn't Syria, it's Iran. And what Obama has refused to do is confront Iran. Now, if we as a nation are not prepared to do what's necessary to confront Iran militarily, and perhaps we're not, and perhaps that isn't a route we should go, but then there's no sense in getting involved in Syria because the government of Syria effectively doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's basically the Iranian regime propping up a Syrian puppet regime. So that's a strategic question that Obama has not yet answered. And I think that's why Americans are quite reasonably reluctant to go into Syria, whether we could win something or not. I mean, he's talking about new interventions now for rebel forces that have been shown now to be dominated by Islamists. Perhaps 2 years ago we could have made a difference, but right now all we'd be doing is arming one group of terrorists to fight another, and I don't think Americans want to go along with that.
Joe Pollak, we're out of time, but thanks very much for your analysis.
Thank you for being with you.